Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome so many people here today, in particular representatives and advocates from student bodies, trade unions, travellers support groups, family resource centres, local development companies, organisations such as Threshold, Focus Ireland, the Simon Community, the National Women's Council, the INOU, Citizens Information and the Workplace Relations Commission. We are here today to launch two important information guides produced by CLM with the assistance of funding from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission. The first on taking employment equality cases, and the second on taking an equal status case in relation to discrimination in accessing goods and services. We are very grateful to be joined by Roderic O'Gorman, Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth, who will launch the guides. We are also delighted to be joined by a panel of excellent advocates, including Suzy Byrne of the National Advocacy Service, Eileen Flynn, Senator and activist on behalf of members of the traveller community, Reuben Hambakachere of Cultur Migrants Centre, and Jane O'Sullivan, Managing Solicitor at CLM, specialising in employment and equality law. Each of the panellists will share their thoughts and experiences on difficulties faced by those experiencing discrimination and barriers to access to justice. I think it's worth saying a few words about why CLM have produced these guides. We have strong legislation in the area of equality. We have equal status legislation, which protects you from certain types of discrimination and harassment when accessing goods and services. So in all those daily activities, many of which we enjoyed pre-COVID and we often take for granted, so going to the shops, going to the pub, getting the bus, going to school, looking for accommodation, the law, through the Equal Status Acts, bans discrimination across 10 grounds. These include gender, civil status, family status, sexual orientation, religion, age, disability, race, membership of the traveller community, and housing assistance in relation to the provision of accommodation. The Employment Equality Acts similarly prevent discrimination against an employee on the first 9 grounds in relation to things like pay and conditions and accessing employment. The laws are there, but they are complex and technical, and there is currently no legal aid available to a person experiencing discrimination in the workplace or in accessing goods and services if they wish to take a case to the Workplace Relations Commission or WRC. The clients that CLM assists are often working in low-paid, precarious jobs and cannot afford the services of a solicitor. They are either forced to represent themselves or they do not pursue a case at all. It's simply too much to expect people in cases like sexual harassment, pregnancy discrimination, or complex equal pay cases to have the resources or capacity to represent themselves, and if a person has a moderate or low salary, it would be difficult to get a solicitor to act for them. The records of the WRC show that very few equal pay claims are being brought despite the fact that we still have a 14% gender pay gap. There are similarly very few cases taken under the traveller community ground, despite well-documented discrimination suffered by this group. Such cases are complex and the absence of legal aid puts a huge barrier to achieving equality in this area. While the guides being launched here today will not address the need for representation in these types of cases, we hope they will demystify the law and make it easier for individuals, including vulnerable groups, to vindicate their rights. We are keen to ensure that the guides are accessible to those who need them most. So in parallel with this launch, we will be running an information campaign on social media. And I would invite anyone attending today to please tweet about the guides and the event using the hashtag CLM Employment and Equality. More importantly, please use and circulate the guides, which are accessible on our website at www.communitylawmediation.ie. I would like to now invite Minister Roderic O'Gorman to officially launch the guides. Thank you, Minister.
That's great, Rose. Listen, thank you very much for your introduction, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here this morning with Community Law and Mediation to launch their 2 new guides, a guide to taking an equal status case and a guide to taking an employment equality case. And I know that both of these guides have been funded through IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, and that obviously falls within the remit of my own department. I think what's particularly beneficial about these guides is that they take, I suppose, what is a two dense pieces of legislation and make them practical, make them accessible for people who are seeking to take a case, to use the benefits of these pieces of legislation. I think we're all very aware how the complexity of the law can be a real barrier to people using the rights that are available there for them. So I think that's the real benefit of these 2 particular guides, giving practical tips, practical examples, and making it easy for people to take an equal status case or an employment equality case to the Workplace Relations Commission. And I think these guides will improve access for justice for those who are seeking to enforce their employment equality and equal status rights. And I understand that as well as the paper guides, there's a digital information campaign been launched in the same time and in tandem with the guides. I think that will really help reach the people who perhaps need this information the most, and particularly help target some of the most marginalized communities in our country, the traveling community, the Roma community, and migrant communities as well. And I'd be acutely aware of the difficulties, of the barriers being faced by the traveling community, the Roma community, and migrant communities. And as you know, my department is responsible for NITRIS, the National Traveller and Roma Integration Strategy, and also the Migrant Integration Strategy. And both of those strategies are due to draw to a close at the end of this year. And we'll be undertaking an examination of those strategies in conjunction with other strategies, such as the National Strategy for Women and Girls, one of the other equality strategies under my department's remit, to examine how their successor strategies can become more effective, and particularly looking at the importance of having more measurable outcomes, because I think a lot of time is spent on inputs into these strategies, but I think kind of tangible outcomes has to be more significant in terms of the successor the successor strategies, and again, obviously ensuring that equality is at the very centre of government policy. The community law and mediation have highlighted some of the issues in this area, and we were indeed speaking about it yesterday when I was speaking with Rose and her colleagues, particularly lack of legal aid for people wishing to take discrimination cases to the WRC, and the very significant decrease in recent years in the number of equal status and employment equality cases being taken by marginalised groups, such as by members of the travelling community. And during the course of this year and into next year, the government will be examining the existing equality legislation. And I think an important part of that will be looking at it in light of the commitment in the programme for government to consider the introduction of a new ground of discrimination on the basis of socio-economic status to both the Employment Equality Act and the Equal Status Acts. And a public consultation will be undertaken about this proposal, hopefully in the second half of this year. And we'll be using that public consultation to kind of draw together information and ideas about the scope of what should be included in this ground, a ground of this discrimination based on economic criteria. So for example, your financial status, your wealth, your property, your source of income, your economic vulnerability, and also then what could be classified as social discrimination as well. So again, your family background, place of residence, occupation, education. And I think particularly on that latter point of place of residence, I think we're all very familiar with stories of people who feel they have to disguise their address in terms of maybe early job applications and something like that. And it's, I think we all acknowledge it's absolutely disgraceful that people should feel they need to hide who they are and where they're from in that way. And I think that is something that I'm interested in seeing how we can use non-discrimination law to really tackle in our country. And obviously that, following on from another commitment in the programme for government, the review of the equality legislation will also look at how the existing gender ground acts and whether it is sufficiently broad to reflect all concepts and understanding of gender. And I think that is something that flows from earlier decisions of the WRC, which revealed perhaps that the existing gender ground isn't as comprehensive as we might like. So obviously the promotion of equality in our society is a key priority for my department and me as minister. And it's absolutely essential that the legislation which protects against discrimination is current and that it operates in a way that is accessible to the most vulnerable in our society. And I think ensuring that law is always kept under review is absolutely important. But I really want to highlight the work that community law and mediation is doing to ensure that the information to allow people to take these cases is available, and how crucial that role that you fulfill is. And I want to particularly commend you for the work you've done in drafting these guides and in supporting those communities that you work with to take these really important cases. Beyond maybe the legislative piece that I've spoken about already, the government remains committed to ensuring that discrimination in all forms is addressed. The Independent Anti-Racism Committee was established by the previous government in June 2019, and it had a mandate to review current evidence and practice and make recommendations to government about how best to strengthen its approach to tackle racism in our society. And it's the Anti-Racism Committee's purpose is to develop an understanding of the nature and the prevalence of racism in Ireland and to work towards achieving a social consensus on the actions that are required by both state and non-state actors. And its work will culminate in the drafting of a new national action plan against racism for consideration by the government. I published the interim report of the Anti-Racism Committee a number of weeks ago, and it set out 3 key areas in terms of removing Ireland's reservation to Article 4 of the UN Covenant Against Discrimination, in terms of taking specific measures to tackle the vulnerability of migrant women to domestic violence, and in terms of bringing in better ethnic data, so we can actually understand in terms of the public service what groups are availing of employment or availing of support, so we can actually measure what's happening. So those are the 3 interim recommendations, but the final report of the Anti-Racism Committee will be provided to me, I hope in August or September of this year. As I say, that will form the basis for a new national action plan against racism. We haven't had an anti-racism plan in this country since 2008. I think it's high time that government take an organised and structured approach to dealing with the real and unfortunately growing prevalence of racism in our country. I think you probably are aware the Anti-Racism Committee is undertaking a public consultation at the moment, and I'm sure many of you in terms of your organisations or as individuals are going to make submissions to that. I know Rose just spoke about the gender discrimination and in the workplace, and particularly the decrease in the number of cases, and just, I suppose, worth highlighting that in terms of gender discrimination, particularly disparities in pay, I will be introducing legislation in the Dáil, not next week, but the following week, on the Gender Pay Gap Information Bill. That's a bill that had been initiated by my predecessor, Minister David Staunton. It didn't get completed in the last Dáil, but I'll be reintroducing it at report stage with a few amendments the week after next, and subsequently then bringing it through the Shannon. So we would hope that that piece of legislation will be passed by the summer, and we will have by next year we will have all the website which will provide that information to the public in terms of the gender pay gap in medium and large employers. And I think that again is an important step. I know the EU are bringing in a piece of a directive on this point at the moment, covering companies up to 250 employees. We're actually going a lot lower than that. We'll be aiming it at companies eventually up to 50 employees, so some from 50 employees on. So we'll be going further than the EU legislative measures. So that's something that will be happening in the near future. So maybe just to conclude then, and I suppose that the work that community law and mediation has been doing helps bring equality to Irish society. I want to thank them for their very dedicated work in this sphere. I think the guides that we're launching today are, as I say, a very practical manifestation of the huge range of work they do, both in supporting individuals taking their cases, but also that wider advocacy role, and again that engagement with government at legislative level and at policy level as well. So I officially launched these 2 guides, Guide to Taking an Equal Status Case and Guide to Taking an Employment Equality Case. And unfortunately, I'm not in a position to stay for the panel, but I've no doubt that Suzy and Reuben and Eileen and Jane will have a very vigorous discussion. And I look forward to maybe hearing the outcome of that, and particularly hearing the engagement of CLM and indeed the many other organisations represented here in terms of the consultation we'll be doing on reforms to the equality legislation later on this year. So thanks very much, and congratulations again to CLM.
Thank you very much, Minister, for launching the guides. I think your words about the complexity of the law and the need to ensure supports for vulnerable groups to access the law are particularly pertinent today. And I'd also very much welcome some of the work that you detailed that your department is going to be undertaking, particularly the follow through with the commitment given in the programme for government to introducing or reviewing the introduction of a socioeconomic ground in terms of the protected grounds in the legislation, but also examining the gender ground, the National Action Plan on Racism, and the introduction of the gender pay gap legislation, all very important pieces of work that have been advocated for a long time. So I very much welcome that work that's going to be undertaken. I understand, as you say, you have a number of commitments this morning and have to leave early, so I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you and for taking the time for being with us here today. We now move on to the next element of the event, which I'm very much looking forward to. We will hear from our panelists about the reality and barriers to justice faced by those experiencing discrimination. We are restricted on time, so unfortunately there won't be an opportunity for questions and answers, and I will be asking each of our panelists to limit their responses to approximately 4 minutes, and apologies in advance if I have to give you a virtual nudge about this time limit. My first question is to Suzy Byrne, who has been involved in community work and campaigning on disability and equality issues for 30 years. Suzy is currently the Regional Manager of the National Advocacy Services for People with Disabilities and is a board member of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. Suzy is also Director of Iarnród Éireann and is one of the first people with a disability to be specifically recruited to a state public transport board. So welcome, Suzy. And my first question to you is, you have written before about the daily difficulties the mobility impaired face in accessing services like public transport. Can you talk about the impact of this and whether societal and institutional attitudes have changed since you started your activism?
Thanks very much, Rose. And actually, on behalf of the National Advocacy Service, I'd like to congratulate Community Law Mediation for the publication of the reports and also for the support that Community Law Mediation provide to the National Advocacy Service and our advocates throughout the country in our complex casework. In the area of transport, my interest probably started as a personal one as I began to need assistance to use public transport and finding that I found difficulties, and more actually was probably the fear of what might happen, and that seems to be a reality for a lot of people with disabilities, that they are afraid because they need assistance that assistance may not be available to them, and that there might be a communication difficulty. So rather than the assistant itself not being there, it's the fear of it that seems to be a huge issue. And it was something that happened to me numerous times where I would not have the assistance I needed to board a train or to come off a train when I got to my destination. And it happened a number of occasions. I would have written and tweeted about it when it happened. I noticed that many other people with disabilities were talking about that also. Other people were talking about fears in terms of harassment from others when they were on the train, bullying or intimidation. And then there were issues, I think, also for those who would need assistance other than the assistance from the transport company. So there would be people who would need personal assistance or assistance from family or friends to get to an actual train or bus station, and the difficulties they had in accessing that. One of the issues I think that a lot of people are experiencing problems with is the mobility allowance scheme, which was ended probably for, as the government at the time said, for equality reasons in 2013 and has not been replaced. And that is actually funding being given to disabled people directly. It's means tested, and it is to help them with the additional costs of transport, particularly where they cannot access public transport themselves. So there's lots of issues there that exist for people in terms of accessing services. There are EU directives on transport which place obligations on both transport operators and the member states to ensure that their services are accessible. It's something I think that we've seen happen in Ireland in various degrees. And there are lots of plans for now, between now and 2040, in terms of the introduction of new, and I will speak in terms of the railways, new transport stock. But also there's a lot of work that needs to be done to stations to make them accessible, so that the trains which will be accessible, well, the platforms need to be accessible as well. In terms of the practical services though as well, I think they're the things that are as important as the physical infrastructure. And I think also we have to think beyond physical disability, and as we work with people across all the various impairments, supporting people in decision making, supporting people in access to information. That includes people with intellectual disabilities, people with acquired brain injuries, people with communication differences. And those things are really important, particularly when you're planning the delivery of services, that you have to think about universal access and design. You have to think across the 640,000 people with disabilities in Ireland, and that's the data that we have from the last census. That's a very large population, and it's people also with their families and friends who want to be able to access services together. All of those issues are really important that I think everybody has to think about, and also in how you communicate that information about services and how to access them, that we need to be thinking about information in easy read formats, information for people who have literacy difficulties, people, visual signs information, those sort of things are all important as well.
Thank you very much, Suzy. And I think you raise a really interesting point, and one I hadn't considered before, about the fear aspect and the fear that people face, as you say, when services or assistance or whatever that might be mightn't be available to them, or in fact the harassment that they might face. And I'm sure that fear has a real impact on them in their daily lives. I'd like to ask my next question now, please, to Reuben Hambakachere, who is the Integration Support Worker with Cultur Migrant Centre in Navan. Reuben is also a trainer and face of the Trend web responsive app used to train people from a migrant background to be job creators in their new host countries. Reuben is on the board of the Irish Refugee Council, Community Work Ireland, and Our Table, a community-driven non-profit project aiming to highlight the issues faced by people living in direct provision. So welcome, Reuben. And my question to you is, as part of your work with Cultur Migrant Centre, you started a unique initiative to help women from a migrant background who face subtle racism that hinders their chance of gaining employment. You have also campaigned for the right to work for people living in direct provision. Can you tell us about some of the experiences of people you have come across in your work, specifically in relation to discrimination in the workplace or when applying for jobs?
Thanks, Ross. And I'd also want to take this opportunity on behalf of Cultur to thank Community Law and Mediation for the work that you're doing and the publication of the guides. We look forward to engaging with the resources and also with the services that you provide. So the initiative that we started, we had identified that a lot of migrant women that are in Ireland, especially those that have gone through the direct provision system, were experiencing discrimination and when they're trying to access employment. So we came together with Myth Partnership, which is not another community group based in County Meath, and we had a program which was Ready for Life Skills. It was mainly for migrant women with STEM 4 and those that were living in the area. So the challenge was how to actually prepare for interviews. So it was soft skills right from just the basic preparing CVs. And what we're getting from most people is that they would have the qualification from back home, and some of them have even trained here and they have a third level of qualification, but they were not able to access jobs in the areas that they trained for. So they were getting precarious employment or just something to keep them going. So we wanted people to actually get access to employment for the jobs that they trained for. So together with Myth Partnership, we set up a program that supported them even how to write a CV and also how to engage with the interviewers during the interview. And one of the things that we were trying to address is the discrimination. Most people would actually, the minister mentioned disguising addresses, but for migrant women, it was also having to just, for some who had European names or English names, just to put the name without putting the surname for them to be able to just to get into an interview, less alone getting the job. So most women would say that they would put in their full name, and just for the name, their CV is not picked up when the screening process is happening. So that's not only for migrant women, it's only for a lot of migrants. This has happened to me. It has happened to my friends that I speak to. They would actually apply for a job and they won't even be called for an interview, even though they know that they're qualified for it. And some have gone to the point that they would arrive at an interview. I was talking to one woman, she actually was successful in getting an interview because she just put a first name. So they didn't know that it was a Black woman that was coming for the interview. So when she arrived, because of the name that she had put in, they saw the name there. So when she arrived at the reception and she actually said, "I'm so and so," and they looked at the list of names that they had, they saw the name was there, and the person that was in front, according to the person at the reception, didn't suit the name that was on the list because of the color of the skin. So she was told to wait. And as she was waiting, other people came in, those who had the time for appointment arrived, and she was not called in for the interview, but other people were called in for the interview, and she was told to wait. And she waited until she was actually fed up of waiting. No one told her anything, and she had to leave the place. So she was actually knocked back, because just for someone who has come into Ireland to look for employment, it takes a lot of confidence to step out there. Because first, when you come into Ireland, the system itself that people mostly go through knocks them back, and their confidence levels is not the same as everyone else who wants to access employment. So they have to grapple with that, the discrimination, and then building the capacity to be able to articulate issues that you are facing. It takes time, and it takes a lot of support, and some of that support is not available. So the program that we worked with women that we wanted to return to employment or training, it actually took care of how to build the capacity for people to go back and address the challenges that they face when they go through interviews. It took time, but by the time we had completed this, it was a 2-year program. By the time we completed this, we had 14 women who had returned to employment on part-time, and some of them were full-time. But what we're getting, the feedback we're getting, is that just because they engaged, and this project I was working with Dedra Darling, she's an Irish lady living in County Meath. One thing most women were saying is, this is the first time I've actually come in contact with an Irish person that has treated me in a professional setting, that has treated me well while looking for employment. So just that fact that they had that engagement with someone from the Irish culture, engaging with them in a very safe space, gave them the confidence to be able to face someone who is interviewing them. So it's very important that migrant women are supported at those stages and throughout the process until they actually secure employment.
Thank you, Reuben. And I think a lot of the issues that you described there, we would come across them in our legal advice clinics. And I think you make an interesting point about it's not just access to employment, but it's access to the right kind of employment, and one which reflects the person's expertise and skills and education. I'd like to ask my next question to Senator Eileen Flynn, who is the first member of the traveller community to serve in the Houses of the Oireachtas. Her background is in community development and activism on behalf of Irish travellers and in solidarity with other ethnic minorities. In the past, Eileen has worked with organisations such as the Irish Network Against Racism, Ballyfermot Travellers Action Group, National Traveller Women's Forum and Apollo House. So welcome, Eileen. And the question for you is, throughout your activism, you have spoke about the lack of opportunities available to members of the traveller community and feeling when you were young that you weren't going to get the big job like other people. Can you tell us about the types of issues in higher education and in employment that you come across through your work?
Yeah, firstly, Rose, I would like to thank Community Law and Mediation for the invitation to be here this morning. And I do welcome the Minister's, the Minister bringing forward around the gender gap in inequality over the next 2 weeks. And also, I think while there's a lot being done at present, an awful lot more needs to be done for ethnic minority groups and to support law firms that will support ethnic minority groups. Firstly, many people from ethnic minority groups, from the Black community, refugees, travellers, people with disabilities and people who are disabled, don't even know that the WRC exists, that information being visible out there for people. And when we talk about taking cases to the WRC, firstly, we need people to be in employment. We need that equal opportunity, and we need, as Reuben has just said, meaningfulness in employment for people from ethnic minority groups and people who are disabled. And unfortunately, we don't get those equality of opportunities, And yesterday at a committee meeting, what really struck me, we were speaking about employment within the traveller community, and over 80% of my community is unemployed. And yesterday I would have said that without like the 20+% that is employed, some of them are applied by traveller organisations like NGOs, community development work, primary healthcare workers. And it's great to empower the traveller community to work, because many people people within my community want to work, just like many people within who are migrants but we're not treated fair, and we don't have that equality of opportunities to be able to work. From my work that I've done with the Migrant Rights Centre of Ireland, going back in 2015, I learned a lot about au pair work and the women being undermined and working for a week, say for €100, and being carers within another family's home, or the work that many travellers do, and not being even on the minimum wage, and the same for people from other ethnic minority groups. So I just want to I think it's really important to highlight that this morning. And yesterday I was speaking to Jane around this morning's event, just to be sure that I knew what I was speaking about, like being nervous. And I was talking about some of my own personal experience of the law system, and not only my experience, but many members of the traveller community that, and people from ethnic minority groups, other ethnic minority groups, that don't trust in the law system. We feel failed by the justice system in Ireland. A young man said to me, going back before Christmas, actually in December, Eileen, court tomorrow, have you any advice for me? And I was like, just go in and be yourself, explain to the judge you're a good man, and like you're doing a FOSS scheme at the moment, blah blah blah. And he said to me, isn't it ridiculous? He said, I already feel guilty, he said, and as soon as I go into that courtroom, I'm going to be found guilty just because I'm a member of the traveller community. And that makes me very emotional to even think that that's the attitude of young men and young women. Traveller community are overrepresented, and the latest figures will show that in the women's prison and in the men's prisons in Ireland. So we have to look at a fair justice system where our judges and our balancers and solicitors are qualified to work with ethnic minority groups and meet people where they're at, and be trained in that not everybody is white settled people, and that we don't all have to be normal if you want, because people with people from different minority groups and what we define as normal, we're all different and should be treated as equal in the world. But unfortunately, I believe that the traveller community have very little trust within the justice system because of years of oppression and years of how we've been treated. So I think it's really important to have services such as the community law and mediation firm and the likes of FLAC. I know the Irish Traveller Movement in the past, my experience, has had a law firm, and unfortunately that funding was taken away, So for me, myself, I'll just give a little bit of experience with the justice system. In 2012, I took a case against the Dublin City Council, and the case was thrown out. It was a Good Friday, and we couldn't get any services because we had to attend the traveller only services within the Dublin Corporation. And again, it was an inequality case that was took, but Susan Fay would have took that case with me. And unfortunately, I had to let it go because I was told there'd no ground to stand on. In 2017, a member of the Gardaí in the Houghton site here in Ballyfermot in Laborie Park, we were outside. It was a few days before Christmas. I only put up the Christmas tree, and my brothers were out in the garden, and we're out, and I went out to have a cigarette, and up comes members of the Gardaí, and one fella, he drove up the site and came back down the site and stopped outside the door of my house and said to me and to the men in the garden, he said, "This pack of scummy knackers." That was the word that came out that guard's mouth. And I'll never forget the hurt that I felt, that we're meant to be protected by the guards and by the system. They're the people that we trust the most to protect our communities, and not all guards are bad people, of course. So it's important to make that clear. Went down to the Garda station, filed a complaint, and opened up a case against the member of the Gardaí who called us a pack of scummy knackers. and it was a GSOC investigating the guards. So it was all this questioning to about 8 men, and kept questioning, and we just felt undermined, not believed. And again, that case was thrown out. So that there was the second time. And I'll just give you a little example of the third time. I was refused from a nightclub in Dublin. The Penny Blue was the name. It was all over the media, so I can name it here. And basically, it was a hard case. It was really hard. I'll never forget it. I was 6 months pregnant with my daughter Billy, going through postnatal depression while I was pregnant. Went to the courtroom, stood up, said me evidence what happened, and the judge said to me, bareface, he said, "You don't look like a traveller," he said, "and therefore I'm throwing out this case." And again, that was so hurtful, because what does a member of the traveller community look like? If you're from Dublin and you have what people would say a culture accent or a traveller accent, which I have, you know, bouncers, they know, or security people, men or women, they know that you're members of the traveller community, you know, and especially if they're young security people from around the area, they know that you're travellers. And so that was my experience personally with the justice system in the justice system over the last few years. And I've seen the experience where, you know, if a member of the traveller community was to turn around a car in a place, or was even not even wearing a safety belt, we know that there's a lot of women in the Docus prison who are in there for not paying tax and insurance on their car, and getting heavy sentence because of that, like, you know. So I think that we as a community have to learn to trust in the justice system again. And I think by being engaging with the likes of community law and mediation, and the likes of FLAC and traveller NGOs that can bring that support to us as a community of people. Because, you know, yesterday from my conversation with Jane, I do believe that the justice system can work, and I believe that there's good people within the justice system. But however, I would encourage, I'd keep encouraging traveller people and people from ethnic minority groups to take cases against, if people were treated illy or treated inequality, that they take these cases. But most importantly, I think it's really important, today's event, the review, the publication of the review is so important, and it's so important to engage with members of ethnic minority groups and members who, you know, people, if I went into my family home now and spoke about the WRC, people would say to me, what do you mean, you know? And people need to be educated around it, and that needs to be invested in, and it needs to be supported, and it needs to be funded. But again, the importance of having the community law and mediation forum is for people from ethnic minority groups, to encourage people, motivate people, empower people to keep taking cases if they suffer an injustice within the world. Because the law system, the justice system, you know, is not meant to fail people like us, is meant to protect people like us.
Thank you, Eileen, and thank you for sharing your very powerful story. And I think it's not a unique story. You know, we often come across in our work, you know, how members of the traveller community have been discriminated against in accessing goods and services, and in fact how they're dealt with by the justice system, how you detailed. And I think you raise a really interesting point about the fact that many people haven't even heard of the WRC, or wouldn't realise that the WRC, the Workplace Relations Commission, is somewhere that you can take an equality action. And I think that is a real loss. Like, the loss of the word equality from its name has been a real loss. And I think people don't necessarily know where to take their cases as a result. And they don't have, as you say,
Rose, sorry, and I just think it's really important to add that there's so, as Reuben has pointed out, you know, you can't be proud when you're going for a job interview. You automatically, your self-esteem is going because of who you are, you know, and even when you're even in a job, you're always afraid that you'll be sacked because you're the migrant, because you're the traveller, because you're the person who has a disability or disabled, you know. And I think that's really, really, like, you know, we have to be proud of who we are. And as a young person of 20, when I was 25 years of age, I'm now 31, no longer young, but as a young person, you know, you really struggle with your mental health, like, and And even happened, like my auntie works in the nursing home. And when I got elected, just a little example, you know, everyone else was speaking about it in the nursing home, the nurses, the doctors, the patients, and she couldn't. She couldn't speak about it, and she couldn't say, that's my niece. And she often tells me the story because she needs to hide her identity to be successful, and hide probably the country that you come from or your upbringing to be successful. And it's the same way for working class people too, you know, like if you're from the likes of Ballyfermot, it can be more difficult to get a job, as if, say, if you're like from some parts of Inchicore, say Dublin 8 or Dublin 4, you might be a little bit more successful. And unfortunately, this is the reality for people today still in Ireland. So I just would like to really get that message across, and I'm sorry for cutting across here.
No, thank you, Eileen. I'm going to keep moving on because we're quite limited on time. So our final panelist is Jane O'Sullivan, who is the Managing Solicitor with CLM and member of the Law Society Committee on Employment and Equality. Jane provides legal advice and representation of clients in employment equality and equal status cases, and regularly provides training and other support to advocacy organisations. Jane also works in the area of law reform and has previously addressed the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and Social Welfare Issues as part of the shadow reporting delegation. So Jane, perhaps you could give us some practical examples of cases CLM has taken for clients under the Equal Status and Employment Equality Acts.
Thanks, Rose. And just to say thanks so much again to the Minister and all the panellists for their time, and just welcome to everyone who's joining us today. So we regularly represent people in discrimination cases under both the Employment Equality and Equal Status Acts. And we can see trends emerging all the time. You know, for example, there's persistent discrimination against women returning to the workplace after maternity leave, and serious exploitation and discrimination in certain sectors such as retail, the service industry, care settings, etc. So I have a few little examples of cases just to go through quickly today, and I've changed all the names in the cases that I'll talk about. So one recent case we took actually on behalf of a client under the Equal Status Acts was for age discrimination. So Josephine came to CLM because she felt she'd been discriminated against by her car insurance provider on the basis of her age. She'd been with the same insurance provider for over 40 years and had no history of claims, but Josephine contacted our clinic because her insurance premium was increased substantially from the previous year, even though she'd had no claims and her circumstances hadn't changed. She believed that the change was due to her age, as she was 84 years of age. She was told that the increase in premium was due to the increasing number of fraudulent claims across the Irish insurance market. She then went off and got quotes from other insurance providers that were roughly around the same as the original amount she had been paying before the premium was hiked up. So Josephine decided to take a claim under the Equal Status Acts for age discrimination, and we submitted a complaint to the WRC on her behalf. Now, that matter was settled in advance of the hearing with the payment of compensation for the discrimination she'd experienced. And she felt really strongly that other people should be protected against similar treatment. And she told us she wouldn't have been able to navigate making a claim on her own. So I'll turn to a case now we took on behalf of a client under the Employment Equality Act. So Michael came to us after he'd been forced to retire from his employment on health grounds. He was no longer able to work as a driver for a large transport company as a result of an injury he suffered at work that led to other health problems. So he told his employer that he was willing to do another job within the company, but he was informed that there was nothing available. So we took a claim on Michael's behalf on the grounds that he was discriminated against by his employer because they made absolutely no effort to try and help him to return to work in a different role. The WRC in that case found against Michael, so we appealed on his behalf to the Labour Court, and we again made detailed legal submissions on the law around disability and reasonable accommodation, and the Labour Court found in his favour ultimately and said that he was not consulted in any way regarding his disability and his capacity. Now, Michael was awarded compensation, and even though pursuing the matter, you know, caused a lot of stress and a lot of worry to him because the case was so long running, he was, you know, very proud of the fact, I suppose, that his case had strengthened and clarified the rights of all people with disabilities in the workplace to transparent and consultative procedures when the employer seeks to terminate employment on health grounds. So just quickly, another case that we took under the Equal Status Act was for discrimination under a new ground that was introduced in 2015 to try and stop landlords discriminating against people who were receiving assistance in paying for their housing. So for example, someone on HAP. So Kira in this case had been living in private rented accommodation for more than 6 months and she got sick. She was unable to work, so she applied for HAP. However, she couldn't make contact with her landlord despite all her efforts because she needed information from the landlord in order to apply for HAP. She also tried to engage with the letting agent and she just had no, that was to no avail. So meanwhile, she was coming under increased financial pressure. She couldn't pay her rent. So before the matter was resolved, she received an eviction notice and had to leave the property and move in with family. So we represented Kira before the WRC, and the other side agreed there to pay her compensation for discrimination because we were able to point out other WRC decisions in which landlords were found to be discriminating. So the pandemic, I suppose, has thrown up all kinds of complex employment equality cases. People have phoned our clinic for legal advice for unfair selection for redundancy, for example, as well as people at high risk because of their disabilities not being reasonably accommodated. And in some cases being required to attend the workplace despite being able to do their jobs from home, and really in flagrant violation of the government guidelines. Unfair changes to terms and conditions have become much more prevalent because people agreed during the pandemic to changes on the basis that they were temporary, and they have now kind of continued on. So very briefly to finish on this question, Rose, then just some other cases that we're working on at the moment include a racial discrimination case for a person whose complaint of racial harassment was upheld by her employer, but nothing was done about it and she had to continue working with her harasser. And a person with disabilities who was required to be in the office despite it not being essential and basic hygiene standards not being maintained. So that's just a very quick overview, Rose. I hope kind of gives some idea of the kind of cases that we're involved in and have been involved in.
Thank you, Jane. And I think it's interesting to note that in certainly some of the case studies you discuss how CLM's involvement came, in fact, after their WRC case had been heard and they were unsuccessful. And then through the involvement of the legal support that we provide, through having a solicitor, through having that legal assistance, they were successful at the next stage. They were successful at the labour court stage. And I think that really underlines the need for legal assistance to be provided for people in this area, and it's currently not provided in this area. So just on to Reuben, please. Through your work, Reuben, you are supporting people from a migrant background in realising their rights, and we've heard today about discrimination faced by different groups. Do you believe that there needs to be more support for people realising their rights, and what would this look like?
Yeah, sure. I believe there's a need for people to be supported, and I think what this would look like is creating the conditions, like Eileen mentioned it, that creating the conditions for people to actually be able to access this. And that's by meeting them at the level that they're at, where people are at. So if you meet people where they are, they're able to feel that they're supported and they feel the support coming to them. And the other thing that could be done is to making the information accessible. So what the work that you're doing today, just creating this space for us to be able to engage with you, that's making the information accessible, but we need to take it a step further, bringing this information in accessible languages to people, to different communities, and also bringing it to where they access. So we look at, I work with migrants. So where do migrants meet? Where do they congregate? Bringing leaflets in different languages to those spaces, like mosques, churches, any social gatherings that they have, if you are able to provide that information, and also looking online on social media platforms where there are migrant groups, sharing that information with those groups that you can access. And I think a key to it is actually providing even interpreters for people to have someone to support them to make a case, because you might be able to articulate this in your own language, but it's very difficult to look at legal matter in English, especially if English is not your first language. So that's a barrier for people who cannot speak English. I could be able to speak English, but I don't have the legal jargon to challenge or to communicate the issues that I'm experiencing. And I think also the culture of disbelief that has made a lot of migrants, because of the system, they don't trust the processes. So there's a culture of disbelief that starts off from when a person is applying for asylum in Ireland and the way they are treated by the people that interview them. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed so that people can begin to trust the processes and trust the system, and then also establishing lasting relationships with those communities that are experiencing discrimination, because it's not about engaging in an event and giving the information to people, but what is the relationship after the event? What is the engagement with those groups that we're talking about today after today? So that continued lasting relationship with those groups creates the trust that we're talking about.
Thank you, Reuben. And I think you touched on something really important there, that issue of accessibility and meeting people where they're at and making information, as you say, accessible in terms of language, but also in terms of location. And that is something that we would be very conscious of in CLM, and something that I think COVID has created real difficulties with. We would normally, for example, go out into communities and provide legal advice clinics where people are already meeting and do talks where people are already meeting, as you say. And I do think COVID has created particular challenges to that. And that's something that we need to be aware of. I'm just going to move on to you, Eileen. There has been a marked decrease in equal status cases taken under the Traveller Community Ground in recent years, falling from 416 in 2016 to only 91 in 2019, and only 2 of those cases were in relation to the Employment Equality Acts. And this certainly doesn't reflect the reality. A recent DSRI study has found that travellers experiencing higher levels of discrimination are consistently left behind in education, employment, housing and health. Now, I know you touched on some of these points before, but why in your view do you think people are slow to take cases when they experience discrimination?
In general, Rosa, for any person that's taken an equality case, it's you probably can't. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, you're a little slow, but like we can hear you.
Sorry. Like for anybody that's taken an equality case, it's actually probably one of the toughest cases to take. You know, the ins and outs of it, and like it could take up to 4 years for an equality case just to be heard, you know, and again, people's faith within the system, unfortunately, you know, not like people just don't understand those from ethnic minority groups and take the side of the person who's doing the oppression, you know, instead of taking the side of the person that's going through the inequalities. So I think it's fate within the system, as Reuben clearly pointed out. And again, in 2016 and in earlier days, Traveller Community had support from the Irish Traveller Movement and from other NGOs, and unfortunately that's been taken away now. But now with the law and mediation, community law and mediation, and FLAC, and I know it's been set up a few years, that information is really getting out there today. It's really, people are really finding that these two organisations exist for members of the traveller community, and people, I think, will be taking that on board over the next number of years. I can see it going back up with the community support, I think.
Thank you, Eileen. And I think you're right. I mean, there are services obviously like ourselves and like FLAC obviously have a traveller legal service, which are really important supports for people. But in reality, it's not enough. You know, it's not enough for the level of discrimination out there. It's not enough to provide the supports that are needed. And I think it underlines really there's a need to properly look at what cases legal aid is available for, and we'd hope that is done, you know, when the review is scheduled this autumn. Suzy, Jane, I'd like to come to you next, please, about the WRC process itself. I mean, how accessible is it for people taking employment equality and equal status cases, and what is required in terms of what is required of claimants?
Yeah, thanks, Rose. So, I mean, a lot of efforts have been made to make the process more user-friendly and accessible, but issues still do remain, and particularly for those who have experienced discrimination. So firstly, the process is increasingly online. So there's issues there for people who don't have internet access or experience using the internet. Another issue is the front loading of cases. So the WRC can require people to send in a written statement before the hearing detailing the circumstances of the discrimination and also any legal arguments that they will rely on. So a lot of our clients have told us that they would have felt completely overwhelmed and intimidated having to do this on their own. And it's particularly particularly difficult as well for those with literacy problems, or those who have intellectual disabilities or whose first language isn't English. In one case, for example, we represented a woman in a case in relation to the racial discrimination and harassment she suffered in her workplace. So the client there, we'll call her Lisa, came to CLM after her case against her employer, alleging racial discrimination and harassment had failed before the WRC again. She was racially harassed by her manager, and she was called names in front of staff and customers. She worked in a fast food shop. So she made a complaint to senior management and was promptly sacked the following day. So the adjudication officer, though, at the WRC found against Lisa. So we looked at the adjudication officer's decision and we advised her that she should appeal it. So the decision made assumptions about Lisa, and without any evidence found that the comments weren't racially motivated. So her claim for victimization wasn't examined really at all in the decision. When we sat down then with Lisa, she told us, that about her experience, and said that she had found the case intimidating and demoralizing. So she didn't have an interpreter in the WRC, was another problem. We appealed the decision to the Labour Court on her behalf and requested an interpreter for her. The Labour Court part heard her appeal, and the employer agreed that the racially abusive language had been used, and they admitted that. So the case was then adjourned, and when we sent the employer our legal submission, they engaged with us and agreed to pay her compensation for discrimination. But Lisa was really clear with us that she would have found the whole process impossible to navigate alone. So another client, we call her Mary, who we represented in a gender discrimination case before the Labour Court. She came to our clinic in Coolock. She was after being unsuccessful in her case before the WRC, where she represented herself. Mary had worked in a restaurant, it was, for about 20 years, and she told us that throughout her employment there was discrimination going on. There was certain men were given longer breaks, whereas female employees were asked to do extra jobs around cleaning and things like that. So on one occasion then, Mary and the only other female member of staff were laid off for a month because there was renovations going on in the business. Mary happened to be passing by and noticed that the male employees were inside working away, and it emerged that they had been kept on to work on the maintenance. So she challenged the decision to the WRC, and again, as I said, was unsuccessful. So we lodged an appeal on her in the Labour Court on her behalf, and we challenged the decision, and we made submissions around, the technical area that is, gender discrimination and employment. So ultimately, her employer approached us just before the hearing and agreed to pay her a settlement. So to finish up, I think a major barrier for people taking cases is a reluctance to take on an employer or a service provider. So there are loads of reasons for this, but a key reason is financial. So if you think of a family, for example, taking an equal status case on behalf of their autistic child who may have been discriminated against while trying to access education, they're not entitled to legal aid, and they may face a legal team representing the Department of Education or the HSE. And likewise, then, if a woman working in a supermarket, we'll say, is fired from her job because she told her employer she was pregnant, she's not entitled to legal aid. If she's not in a union and she can't afford a private solicitor, she may find herself representing herself against a team of employment lawyers. So that's a big issue. And finally, people really need to be informed of their rights and the process of enforcing them. And hopefully the guides will help with that. So thanks, Rose.
Thank you, Jane. And I suppose in that you really highlight the complexity of equal status and employment equality cases, and the difficulty in taking them on your own without legal support, not just in terms of complexity, but also in terms of the stress that's involved and the courage that's needed to push those cases forward. Suzy, I'd like to come to you with my final question for this morning. What do you see as the main barriers to people with disabilities enforcing their rights under the Equal Status and Employment Equality Acts? And is there more that can be done in terms of positive action?
Thanks very much, Rose. I think there's a number of things I think that Jane has already mentioned, but some different things that I'm just thinking about this morning is that when cases go to mediation, the wider societal learning from those cases is often lost because they're not reported on. So if somebody agrees to settle or to go to mediation and reach a resolution there may not be reporting on the fact that discrimination actually took place, or that it was resolved that the institution that was discriminating against has decided to change its practices, and so the wider learning, which I think is very important. Yes, for people and for individuals, it's so important they have the right to take a case and be vindicated, but also we as a society have a huge amount to learn from the cases that go through the WRC. I also agree with you that the loss of the term equality from this process is really damaging. I think for people with disabilities that we work with in NAS, we spend a lot of time building capacity with the people we're working with to indicate and prove to them that they have a right to be treated fairly. And people with disabilities very often don't know what their rights are, because very often their services are not provided to them automatically. They have to fight for everything. So if they're treated badly, or they perceive that they've been treated badly in the receipt of a service or in employment, they're afraid to do anything about it, or they don't know that they can do anything about it. And I think that access to legal support is really important. Very often advocates can be supporting, we would support people in communication with legal professionals to support them in decision making, to ensure that people understand the information that's being communicated and what decisions they as individuals might have to make in communicating with a solicitor. But if you're not able to afford to have a solicitor or access somebody, that's really, really difficult then when you're going in to take a case. And I also would highlight the fact that making applications for cases is really difficult if you don't understand the forms or fill in the forms. That's a huge challenge for people. So I think it's something that really does need to be looked at. Finally, I want to talk about the term reasonable accommodation. That's a very wide term these days. 20 years ago, I think people thought it was very limiting. But now we're a changed society now. And what's reasonable now is far more reasonable than it was 20 years ago. And I think people with disabilities need to know what they can expect from that term reasonable accommodation in terms of the supports to be provided in employment or equality.
Thank you, Suzy, for that. And indeed to all the panelists for such an interesting and informative discussion. It's an issue that could be discussed for much longer, I think, but unfortunately, due to time constraints, we will have to leave it there. I think, though, it is clear from the panel discussion that discrimination exists. It is widespread and it has a devastating impact on those who experience it. It's also clear that there are significant barriers to those who are discriminated against and who are seeking to vindicate their rights. It is CLM's view that a very serious barrier is the fact that legal aid is not currently available in cases before the WRC, which seek to challenge discrimination in the workplace or in accessing goods and services. Employment and equality cases, as we have heard, can be itself can be inaccessible. The intention in creating the WRC was to remove the need for lawyers, but in practice, employers, service providers, and public bodies are very often legally represented, creating concern from the point of view of the balance of power and natural justice. There is no logical reason why the availability of legal aid should be determined by area of law rather than need, or why tribunals such as the Workplace Relations Commission should be excluded from legal aid. A person's job and their ability to access accommodation and other goods and services are critical to social inclusion. And when threatened, there are significant adverse consequences, not just for the individual themselves, but also for their family. Against the backdrop of COVID-19, where CLM has seen a 60% increase in requests for information, advice on employment matters, and a 40% increase in the area of housing and homelessness, never has reform and expansion of the civil legal aid scheme been more vital. We welcome the recent introduction by the announcement by the Department of Justice of their plans to review the civil legal aid scheme in the autumn, but it's critical that the extension of legal aid to employment and equality cases before the WRC is considered as part of that review. We similarly welcome the commitment in the programme for government, and as discussed today by Minister O'Gorman last October, of examining an introduction of a new ground of discrimination based on socioeconomic disadvantaged status. This is something which has been advocated for by many organisations working in the areas of equality and social inclusion for some time, and would provide the clients that access CLM's clinics with a legal remedy where they are discriminated against on the basis of their family background, geographic location, whether they owned a home, or their educational background. Before we finish, there are a number of people I would like to thank. Firstly, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission for funding the guides under their grant scheme, our managing solicitor Jane O'Sullivan and barrister Michael Kinsley for their work in producing the guides, everyone involved in organising today, in particular Liz Devine, the Minister and the panellists for attending and participating in the event, all our clients whose courage in taking a case to remedy a wrong and challenge an injustice continues to inspire us in CLM. And finally, to all of you for attending this event today. Thank you very much and have a good day.